Stop looking at Reims Cathedral as a beautiful postcard. Stop seeing it as a triumph of medieval faith and determination. Look at it as a strange fact that's been lying in plain sight for too long, a fact that doesn't add up when you actually think about what you're seeing. Reims Cathedral, northern France. Its walls rise like assembled force. Cold, precise, impossibly confident for their supposed era. Stand in front of it, and there's a feeling you can't shake. You're not looking at people who built as they could, experimenting and learning as they went. You're looking at people who built as they knew, and they knew far too much. We're told this is 13th century. Construction began around 1211. The bulk of it, this massive stone monument, was supposedly completed in just a few decades. Think about that timeline. Not centuries, not 5 generations of gradual progress, decades. Now think about the tools. No electricity, no computers for structural calculations, no steel, no concrete, no cranes powered by engines, just hands, horses, wooden scaffolding, and simple rope and pulley systems. That's the official story. Then how does such a primitive toolkit even produce a structure that in precision and scale looks almost like a challenge to everything around it? The numbers don't whisper, they scream. Nearly 150 meters long, the interior nave reaches approximately 38 meters high. The width spans about 15 meters. The 2 towers on the western facade climb to roughly 80 meters. To put that in perspective, you're looking at the equivalent of a 26-story modern building. Except it's not steel and glass. It's stone, carved limestone, tons upon tons of it, extracted from quarries, shaped with hand tools, transported by cart and horse, then lifted to heights where a single mistake means death. Every block had to be cut to precise measurements. Every arch had to distribute weight perfectly, or the whole thing collapses. The mathematics of load-bearing, thrust, and counter-thrust had to be exact, not approximate, not quote zero, but exact. One miscalculation in the flying buttresses and you don't get a cathedral, you get a pile of expensive rubble and a lot of dead workers. Does this sound like trial and error to you? Does this sound like medieval craftsmen figuring it out as they go? It doesn't look like learning, it looks like knowing. Here's what makes it even stranger. While these cathedrals were supposedly being designed and built with mathematical precision that wouldn't be formally codified for centuries, the surrounding society was still predominantly illiterate. Most people lived in wooden structures. Most technology was basic: agriculture, simple metalwork, rudimentary trade. The printing press didn't exist yet. Universities were rare and new, yet somehow in the middle of this world, master builders were executing structural engineering that required advanced geometry, precise weight calculations, and organizational logistics that would challenge a modern construction company. Why does the construction technology look several steps ahead of everything else? Why is there this bizarre island of advanced capability sitting in the middle of medieval Europe like it dropped from somewhere else entirely? The official answer is always the same: faith, determination, and skilled craftsmen working over time. It sounds beautiful. It sounds inspiring. It also sounds like someone hoping you won't do the math. The most interesting part is just beginning. Write in the comments what city you're from, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe. The tension is rising. Who's watching us from where? Drop a like and subscribe to the channel. There's more to come. Mark yourselves in the comments. Which country are you from? Hit that like button and subscribe. The plot thickens. Let's check our geography right where you are right now. Smash that thumbs up and subscribe. We're just warming up. Tell us, where are you watching from? Support the video with a like and hit that subscribe button. The climax is near. Share what corner of the world you're in right now. Drop a like and make sure to subscribe. Things are developing rapidly. Write your city in the chat, slam that like, and hit subscribe so you don't get lost. All the juiciest stuff is ahead. Let's get acquainted. Who's from where? Hit like and subscribe right now. The intrigue is building right where you're watching this episode from, and reward us with a like and subscription. Emotions are off the charts. Quickly write what city you're from, drop a fat like and subscribe to the channel, because when you start really calculating what it would take to build something like this with the claimed tools and timeline, the fairy tale falls apart, and what you're left with is a question nobody seems to want you asking. If they didn't have the capability, then who did? Let's talk about something nobody wants to discuss in detail. Where did all that stone actually come from? Hundreds of thousands of tons of limestone don't just appear at a construction site. They have to be extracted somewhere. They have to come from specific quarries with specific locations. There should be mines, access roads, documentation of extraction rights, records of how many workers were stationed there, how the operation was organized. Stone doesn't materialize out of thin air, but here's where it gets interesting. When you start looking for detailed information about the quarries that supplied Reims Cathedral, specifically where they were, how they operated, how much stone came from each source, you don't find a clear picture. You find vague references, general statements. Local limestone was used. Stone was quarried from the region. The region! That's not an answer, that's fog. For a project of this magnitude, there should be detailed records, contracts, disputes over land rights, documentation of mining operations that would have employed dozens or hundreds of workers for decades. Instead, what you get is silence dressed up as history. Now let's talk about moving it. Assume the stone came from quarries 20 to 30 kilometers away, a conservative estimate often mentioned in general terms. You're transporting massive blocks over that distance using medieval roads. And by roads, we mostly mean dirt paths that turn to mud when it rains. A single large limestone block for the main structure could weigh 2 to 5 tons. Some architectural elements weighed considerably more. You're moving these on wooden carts pulled by horses or oxen. A heavy load cart might carry 1, maybe 2 blocks at a time, depending on size. Let's do simple math. If the cathedral required, conservatively, 200,000 tons of stone total, and each cart carries 3 tons per trip, that's roughly 66,000 cart trips. Over a distance of 25 kilometers each way, that's 50 kilometers round trip. 66,000 trips times 50 kilometers equals 3,300,000 kilometers of total transport distance. At a loaded cart speed of maybe 3 kilometers per hour on medieval roads, each round trip takes roughly 17 hours. Add time for loading and unloading, and you're looking at multiple days per delivery cycle when you factor in rest for animals and workers. Where were the relay stations? Where did they store the stone during transport? Where are the records of the massive horse and oxen populations needed to sustain this? Where did they stable them? What did they eat? Who managed the logistics? These aren't minor details. This is the kind of infrastructure that should leave traces. Lots of them. Supply chains like this require organization, planning, constant maintenance, security to prevent theft, veterinary care for animals, repair stations for carts, food storage for workers. Show me the records. Show me where the transport camps were. Show me the infrastructure. You can't, because it's not there. And it gets worse when you think about the construction site itself. To build something like Reims Cathedral over several decades, you need hundreds, possibly thousands of workers on site continuously. These aren't people who walk in for a day and leave. They live there for years. Where did they sleep? Where did they eat? Where were the workshops for tool repair and stone carving? Where were the forges for metalwork? Where was the medical facility for injuries? And there would have been many injuries. Where did they store materials? Where were the security barracks to prevent theft and maintain order? A project this size isn't just a construction site. It's a small city. There should be remains of worker settlements. There should be detailed descriptions and chronicles about daily life, organization, the logistics of feeding and housing this workforce. Instead, you get chronicles that mention the construction in grand, sweeping terms, but barely touch the mundane reality of how it actually functioned day to day. Where are the worker camps? This isn't just strange. This looks like a cut-out piece of reality, like someone described the result but carefully avoided describing the process. There's a lot of result here. The cathedral stands, you can measure it, photograph it, walk through it, but the moment you try to find the detailed traces of how it came to be, the quarries, the transport infrastructure, the worker settlements, everything becomes blurry, as if history was written to sound beautiful but not to be specific. Here's where it stops being about one cathedral and starts being about a pattern. Because Reims isn't alone. Notre-Dame de Paris, Chartres, Amiens, Cologne, Salisbury, the list goes on. And when you look at their origin stories, something very convenient keeps appearing: fire. Stone cathedrals, again and again, are said to have been erected on the sites of burned wooden churches. The old structure burns down. Tragic, devastating, and then suddenly, there's justification for building a massive stone replacement. Once or twice, you'd call it coincidence. But when almost every major Gothic cathedral has the same backstory, a convenient fire that destroyed what came before, this stops being coincidence and starts being a template. Notre-Dame de Paris, built after a fire. Chartres, major fire in 1194 destroyed the previous structure. Reims, fire in 1210, construction begins 1211. Canterbury Cathedral, fire in 1174. Do you see the pattern? These fires are too frequent and too perfectly timed. They arrive exactly when needed to explain why grand construction suddenly begins. It's as if they're required to create an illusion of continuity. Quote 4, "But what if the fires are just a narrative device, a convenient explanation that masks something else entirely, that these structures were being raised or restored from something that already existed, and the fire story provides cover for why there's suddenly this enormous project happening? Then there are the architects themselves. Take the mysterious master builder of Reims, sometimes referred to simply as Jean d'Orbay, or other shadowy names that appear in fragments. We're told these were the brilliant minds behind these structures, but where are their biographies? Where are their training records? Where are the schools they attended or the students they taught? In a world where knowledge was precious and carefully guarded, where would these masters have learned such advanced techniques? Who taught them? Where are the earlier, simpler buildings that show their progression from apprentice to master? You don't find them. Instead, you find names attached to structures, sometimes the same name appearing across centuries of construction in different locations, which makes no chronological sense. It's as if these _quote_6_ are placeholder signatures, neat labels stuck onto projects so the buildings have a proper attribution in the historical record. This doesn't sound like a living world of craftsmen where knowledge is passed down, refined, and multiplied through generations. This sounds like names written onto empty spaces just so the miracle has an author and everything looks properly documented. And then there's the architectural language itself. These cathedrals share more than just a style. They share specific motifs, symbols, and structural patterns that repeat across vast distances. The rose windows, the flying buttresses designed with nearly identical engineering principles, decorative elements and symbolic carvings that appear in France, then Spain, then Germany, then England. This isn't just fashion, spreading slowly through trade and communication. This is a unified language of stone, the same grammar, the same vocabulary, the same syntax appearing in structures supposedly built by independent masters who had limited contact with each other. If the language is this unified, the source could have been unified too. This is no longer a story about separate cities hiring separate masters to build separate monuments of faith. This is starting to look like something else, like these structures share a common origin that predates the convenient stories we've been told. Silence about quarries, silence about worker camps, convenient fires everywhere, shadow architects with no real history. A universal architectural language that transcends borders. The more these elements pile up, the stronger the feeling becomes. We're not looking at history. We're looking at a carefully selected retelling edited to hide something much larger. Now let's talk about the one thing that can't lie: numbers. We've established the scale. We've questioned the logistics. But here's where the entire official narrative doesn't just crack, it shatters completely. Because when you look at the human resources required versus the human resources actually available, the math produces an impossible equation. Let's start with who was supposedly doing this work. During the period when these cathedrals were being constructed, roughly 1150 to 1350, France's total population was somewhere between 13 and 20 million people. That sounds like a lot until you understand the distribution. Medieval France was overwhelmingly rural, We're talking about 85 to 90% of the population living in small villages, engaged primarily in subsistence farming. They grew food, they raised livestock, they made basic tools. Most never traveled more than 20 kilometers from their birthplace in their entire lives. Cities existed, but they were small by modern standards. Paris in 1300 had maybe 200,000 people. Reims had perhaps 20,000. Most urban centers had populations in the low thousands. The bulk of the population lived locally, solved problems locally, and had neither the training nor the organizational framework for massive coordinated projects. Now connect this reality with what building a cathedral actually requires. You need master stone carvers who can work to precise specifications. You need engineers who understand complex load calculations. You need logistics coordinators managing supply chains. You need foremen organizing hundreds of workers. You need skilled laborers who can execute detailed plans. You need support staff, cooks, guards, medical personnel, tool maintenance crews. This isn't a village barn raising where everyone pitches in for a weekend. This is a decades-long industrial operation requiring specialized skills, constant coordination, and systematic organization. Where do these highly qualified people suddenly come from in a society that's 85% rural farmers? Think about it practically. To maintain construction at the pace claimed, you'd need to pull skilled workers from other projects, from other regions, creating a massive drain on available expertise. You'd need training programs to produce new skilled workers. You'd need systems to feed, house, and pay them for years. You need a system, constant supplies, disciplined coordination, accounting, quality control, security, provisioning. If most people around you are living rural, localized lives focused on survival and basic craft, where does this system come from? But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Population growth over the last 200 to 250 years has been relatively steady and well documented. We can track it through census records, birth and death registers, statistical models. The rates are consistent and predictable. Now reverse those growth rates backward, apply them to the medieval period, project them further back to the era when these cathedrals were supposedly designed and built. The model produces an absurd result. By the time you reach the early medieval period, you'd have only about 18,000 people remaining on the entire planet. 18,000. Now, the point isn't to claim this number is literal truth. The point is this: when you apply simple textbook mathematical models backward through time and they produce wildly impossible results, it means something is fundamentally wrong with the framework itself. Either the population numbers we've been given are incomplete or incorrect, or there were massive catastrophic collapses, plagues, wars, disasters that reduced populations so dramatically that the official records barely mention them, or don't mention them at all. When basic mathematics produces absurd inconsistencies, it's not the math that's broken. It's the story the math is trying to support. So you're left with a medieval society that's mostly rural, mostly illiterate, mostly focused on basic survival, somehow organizing, funding, and executing construction projects that would challenge modern engineering firms with computers and cranes. And when you try to trace the population backward to see where these people even came from, the numbers fall apart completely. The official history shows us magnificent results, but it can't show us a coherent process that makes mathematical sense. There are too many gaps behind the beautiful facade. They show us only what's not dangerous to show. And the most interesting part, the part that could actually explain where this capability came from, is hidden in silence or buried under convenient stories that collapse the moment you start calculating. At some point, the usual version stops holding up with words. Because the more you examine cathedrals as actual projects with real materials, real logistics, real human requirements, the stronger the feeling becomes. They're showing us the result, but systematically hiding the source. If the medieval era didn't have enough people, enough organization, or enough technical capability to produce these structures, then the builders themselves must be sought in another time. This isn't fantasy. This is logical necessity. The hypothesis is simple. Cathedrals aren't the achievement of medieval craftsmanship. They're the legacy of a preceding, highly developed civilization that no longer exists. They're not beautiful buildings erected by faith and determination. They're monuments left behind as a riddle. stone speaking where documents have been erased or never existed. And suddenly, everything starts making more sense. That universal architectural language we talked about, the repeating motifs across France, Spain, Germany, England, even further, stops being mysterious. If there was a unified source, a single advanced culture with a common design language, then of course their structures would share the same grammar, the same engineering principles, the same symbolic vocabulary. This isn't separate cities hiring separate masters. This is remnants of a world that built on a scale we've been taught to think impossible for that era. Now add the photographic evidence. Look at 19th century photographs of these cathedrals, actual documentation from the 1800s, not medieval illustrations. What do you see? You see buildings that already look ancient, worn, weathered. In many images, they're partially buried in accumulated earth with ground levels noticeably higher than the original foundations. Simple, ordinary life flows around them: market stalls, modest houses, people in regular clothes going about daily business. These aren't people treating the structures as recent achievements of their ancestors. These are people living next to giants they seemingly don't fully understand. Not ceremonial heirs preserving sacred knowledge, just regular people existing beside monuments that were already old. If these buildings already looked ancient and half-buried in the 1800s, how old are they really? And here's where the narrative completely inverts. What if these cathedrals weren't built from scratch by medieval society? What if they were restored from ruins? Think about what that changes. If medieval people were engaged not in original construction, but in clearing, repairing, and preserving structures that already existed but had fallen into decay, suddenly the silence around quarries and logistics makes perfect sense. You don't need massive new quarrying operations if you're primarily working with existing stone. You don't need to document the construction of foundations if the foundations were already there. You don't need detailed records of original architectural planning if you're following designs that already existed in the structure itself. If you're not building a new world, but recovering an old one, it's much easier to explain the process with a simple, convenient legend. There was a wooden church. It burned. We built this in its place. The fire narrative becomes the perfect mask. It creates an illusion of continuity. There was something old, now there's something new, everything's a natural progression. But if the reality is that people were raising and restoring already existing stone structures from a previous era, the fire story serves to hide that uncomfortable truth. It explains why there's so much result and so little documented process. And those shadow architects, the mysterious names with no real biographies, no schools, no traceable legacy, they stop being strange when you realize they might not be real authors at all. They're placeholder names, signatures, added to fit structures into a chronology that needed proper attribution. So the buildings get dates, get names, get written into a history that makes them seem like natural products of the medieval world. But the stone itself tells a different story. The hypothesis of a predecessor civilization doesn't require magic or aliens or fantasy. It simply says, perhaps this level of achievement, this scale of organization, this unified architectural language, perhaps it's not medieval Europe's starting point. Perhaps it's someone else's ending point, a layer that survived when everything else collapsed. Stone memory of a world that didn't fit into the convenient chronology we've been taught. A world that was then written into new history, repackaged and attributed to an era that inherited it rather than created it. If a predecessor civilization built these structures, then one question becomes unavoidable. What happened to them? Because they're not here anymore. The people who possess the organizational capability, the technical knowledge, and the unified cultural language to create monuments on this scale, they're gone, vanished, replaced by a medieval society that had to relearn basic engineering principles that should have been common knowledge if there was true continuity. What could break a world so completely that massive stone structures remain standing, but the civilization that built them disappears almost entirely from memory? Not a gradual decline, not a slow fade into obscurity, something catastrophic enough to shatter a sophisticated society while leaving their monuments behind as silent witnesses. Think about what that requires. A collapse so severe that advanced knowledge is lost, that organizational systems disintegrate, that populations are reduced to the point where survivors are scattered, disconnected, focused purely on immediate survival rather than preserving historical records or maintaining complex infrastructure. And here's the uncomfortable part. There are traces of exactly this kind of disruption scattered throughout the historical record, but they're mentioned only in passing, glossed over, treated as isolated incidents rather than evidence of something much larger. The Black Death in the 14th century supposedly killed 30 to 60% of Europe's population. But what if that wasn't the first such event? What if there were earlier catastrophes, plagues, climate disasters, societal collapses that reduced populations so dramatically that entire civilizations effectively vanished, leaving only their stone monuments behind? That reverse population calculation we discussed, the one that produces absurdly small numbers when you project backward, starts looking less like a mathematical error and more like evidence of exactly this kind of massive population collapse. What if the numbers are trying to tell us something? That there were periods when human population crashed so severely that it took centuries to recover, that our current historical timeline smooths over these catastrophic gaps, because acknowledging them would mean admitting we don't actually know our own past? The current historical framework feels too young, too neat, as if everything started fresh after some great interruption that nobody wants to discuss in detail. There's a pattern of mysterious _9_ throughout history, periods where records become sparse, where technological knowledge seems to regress, where sophisticated capabilities disappear, and then mysteriously _10_ centuries later, as if rediscovered rather than continuously developed. What if these aren't just gaps in record keeping? What if they're evidence of actual resets? Catastrophic events that broke civilization so thoroughly that survivors had to rebuild from fragments. Then cathedrals stop being medieval achievements. They become something far more significant, stone witnesses to a world that existed before the catastrophe, monuments that survived the change of eras, evidence that before our current civilization, there was already something larger, more organized, more technically advanced. And if that predecessor civilization built on such a grand scale across such vast territories, unified in their architectural language, coordinated in their construction techniques, then their collapse couldn't have been small or localized. It would have been global, which means the catastrophe that destroyed them would have been global too. Something that could reduce a sophisticated, organized, continent-spanning civilization to scattered survivors who eventually rebuilt, but without full memory or understanding of what came before. Survivors who found themselves living among stone giants they couldn't fully explain, so they created new stories. Stories about medieval faith and determination, about decades of construction, about convenient fires and shadow architects. Stories that sound beautiful, but carefully avoid the real question. What kind of disaster could erase a civilization while leaving their monuments standing? And why has that question been buried under centuries of convenient explanations that fall apart the moment you examine them closely? The most dangerous question isn't even who built these cathedrals. The most dangerous question is this: why have we been trained to look at these stone giants as familiar background instead of as evidence? Think about your education. Think about every history textbook, every documentary, every museum tour. They show you the cathedrals. They tell you they're beautiful. They give you dates and names and stories about medieval faith. But they never encourage you to ask the uncomfortable questions. Why are the quarries unknown? Why are the logistics impossibly vague? Why does the mathematics produce absurd results? Why do population models collapse when projected backward? Why does the timeline compress in ways that make no practical sense? And most importantly, why, when you start asking these specific questions, do you encounter not answers but fog, general statements, vague references, quote 11, quote 12, beautiful words that sound like explanations but contain no actual substance? This isn't accidental. This is a pattern. We're living in a historical narrative that's been carefully constructed to prevent exactly this kind of questioning. A narrative that presents the past as settled, understood, fully documented, when the reality is that huge pieces are missing, and the pieces we're shown don't fit together when you actually examine them. If cathedrals are inherited from a predecessor civilization, if they're evidence of a catastrophic reset that destroyed an advanced world and forced humanity to rebuild from fragments, then our entire understanding of history is false. Not just wrong about details, false at the foundational level. It would mean we're not living in a continuous civilization that gradually progressed from primitive to advanced. It would mean we're living in a recovery civilization, survivors of something that broke the previous world so completely that we lost most of our own history and had to create new stories to fill the gaps. And if that's true, then everything changes. How recent was this catastrophe? How much of what we call our civilizations actually recovered rather than invented? How many other structures around the world, pyramids, megaliths, ancient temples, are also inherited rather than built by the cultures we attribute them to? Are we living in a carefully constructed narrative designed to hide the fact that we don't actually know our own past? Because that's what the evidence suggests when you strip away the beautiful stories and look at the raw facts. The logistics don't work. The mathematics don't work, the demographics don't work, the timeline doesn't work, but the cathedrals stand. Stone doesn't lie, stone doesn't forget, stone doesn't care about convenient narratives or official chronologies. And maybe that's exactly why they want you looking at postcards instead of asking questions, why they want you admiring beauty instead of calculating tonnage, why they want you accepting convenient explanations instead of demanding specific documentation. Because if enough people start questioning, really questioning with numbers and logic and refusal to accept vague generalities, the entire historical framework starts to crumble. And what's underneath might be far more disturbing than anyone's prepared to acknowledge. That we're living in the aftermath of something catastrophic. That our history is younger and more fragmented than we've been taught. That the stone monuments we walk past every day aren't products of our civilization's achievement, but remnants of someone else's ending. Evidence of a world that was destroyed, then carefully written out of existence and replaced with fairy tales about medieval craftsmen and decades of construction. Next time you see a cathedral, don't see a postcard. See evidence. Don't see history. See a riddle carved in stone that nobody wants you solving. And ask yourself, what else are they not telling us? Because if they've hidden this, if they've buried the truth about our most visible monuments under centuries of convenient lies, what else has been erased from the record? What else are we